Hi and welcome to Manibil. I wanted to add a few comments to a new video by a guy called Mind Body Solution, who has recently done an interview, round 2 of an interview series with Bernardo Kastrup. And as you know, at this point in time, Bernardo Kastrup is my favorite version of what would you call it, right? Not like I'm obsessed with him, but he is so strongly represented in what we could call the idealist approach to metaphysics, right? And of course, I want to understand and scrutinize what he's saying, trying to understand how he gets to from A to B to C in his structure of argumentation. And I find huge problems. And of course, I want to point them out, right? So if I was, could be led to some kind of conclusion based on his philosophy that were erroneous, I would like to find that out. So therefore, I scrutinize it. And when I find something I find to be ridiculous or unfounded leaps or whatever you want to call it, I want to find it and also point it out so that other people might not find themselves digging into philosophy that is not functioning, right? No, I can't tell you what to think, and I will always be a proponent for somebody who says, think for yourself. Don't take my word for it, right? Do your own thinking. I'm just encouraging your own thinking, so to say, right? Okay, I want to jump into first, before I get into sort of the deeper end, right? A comment he makes here, and I in my recent new deconstruction of a series on analytic idealism, which is the name he calls his metaphysics, Bernardo Kastrup, that is, where he mentions various things that are happening to people's brains and minds and whatever that makes them all of a sudden do some new stuff, right? And I pointed out that what he's implicitly doing without realizing it is encouraging things that could possibly damage your brain and mind or even kill you, right? Without saying, please don't do this at home or something like that. And now he does it again, man, right? I can't, I mean, it's like, where's your head, man, right? Where is your thinking? Are you so caught up in your cloud castles of academia that you can't understand how people who are sort of a weak personality or might say, well, I want to shoot a bullet through my head so I can become a genius of some kind, right? Don't do this at home. Disclaimer, right? I'm disclaiming this. I want to point it out in order to say to you, be careful with this guy. He doesn't know what he's saying and doing, right? He doesn't come across somebody who understands the potential side effects of what he's arguing, right? Okay.
I think let's move on to chapter 5, because you've already dived quite deep into analytical idealism at this point.
I might mention first that this course here, apparently it's a crash course on analytic idealism, where they jump from various chapters in Bernardo Kastrup's couple of year old course on idealism, analytic idealism, and you can find that online on Essentia Foundation and possibly Bernardo's YouTube channel, whatever, right? It's sort of an orange kind of thumbnail. Should be no problem. Course in analytic idealism, and you find it. And each chapter in that one is referenced here in chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this crash course here. So we are doing a particular, I think it's, let me see, this is chapter 5. We review empirical evidence from the fields of foundations of physics and neuroscience of consciousness. Yeah, right. Okay, let's hit it.
Chapter 5 is, we review empirical evidence from the fields of foundations of physics and neuroscience of consciousness, which seems to directly contradict mainstream physicalism and suggest the validity of analytic idealism.
So one of these things we already touched upon, which is the physical entities do not have standalone reality. They are
Okay, but that depends on what you mean by standalone, right? I mean, it's. I remember the recent article about seeking out the odd or something like that. I'm paraphrasing an article on Essentia Foundation about focusing on one thing, right? If you're focusing on one part of your experience, it must be because there's some significance to that particular aspect that you're focusing on or paying attention to, which I think was the term used, right? But if it's based on something, or if it's not based on something that has some kind of standalone something, why are you focusing then, right? Then why those colors and sounds rather than those colors and sounds over there? And a bit of that color, a bit of that sound, and a bit of that taste or whatever, right? So I find a lot of word salad in this idealism, and it's prevalent among people who sort of is attracted to that direction of thinking, right? That it ends up being juggling around words. And it's like, oh, well, I have this definition of the word, so I guess that's how reality is because I like this word, sort of. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily it's the underlying philosophy is completely dysfunctional, but the way the words are used is sort of just linguistic hand waving of a kind, right? I don't like that. I like things to be structured and anchored in a prior definition or a prior axiom or a prior argument or something like that, right? You can't just say, that's a bicycle, therefore there's an external world. That doesn't work, right? It doesn't follow from your argument. It's this kind of, and it's particularly worrying because this is at the foundation level of the idealism, of idealism in general, but in particular analytic idealism. This kind of hand wavy, I guess it's the case, because I can't argue otherwise. So it must be the case, sort of. I don't buy it, right? I seriously don't buy it, but I'm stepping a little ahead of myself here, right? Just trying to clarify where we are in this kind of philosophy.
Used out of an act of measurement. And this is very easy to understand with the dashboard metaphor.
No, but if whatever you are referring to only exists when you're measuring it, what are you actually talking about then? Well, if something is experienced and that was correlated with whatever event you created you called science, well, yes, obviously, because you created it in order to do science, right? When you're doing this sort of, when you call it measurement, you're moving shit around and, bringing along electrodes and computers and whatever you're doing. Of course, if you didn't bring along this shit, you wouldn't have that experience, obviously, right? If I didn't bring along my laptop here, I wouldn't have this particular experience. So I'm bringing along something that is necessary to create that particular experience I expect to have. But does that mean that if I didn't bring my laptop along, the laptop wouldn't exist? That's I don't buy that. That is too much on the wrong side of skepticism, in my opinion. Where I would say that if I don't experience my laptop, I don't know laptop, right? And that particular instance of a laptop I call my MacBook here, right? If I don't experience my MacBook, I don't know my MacBook. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? I can say that because I'm not experiencing that it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist cannot possibly be an experience, right? So you can never say something doesn't exist because you're not experiencing that which doesn't exist, right? I mean, and that's what I want to point out. They get into these convoluted, weird kind of circle jerking linguistic, conundrums that seems that comes across to me like you want to go there because it's so fluffy, and you're going to sort of use this shell game of words to say, aha, and out pops reality, right? Rather than saying, okay, I'm starting with my screen of perception, which he talks about, right? Okay, when I have this screen of perception, I can define this as this and that as that, and I can argue for this and I can argue for that, and then I reach this point. Okay, when I am this point, I would argue for this, that, and the other, using either that it follows or an axiom that says I'm going to go with this because I need it, and so on. But it's only me who does it. It's my axiom, sort of, right? No, they go into these elaborate, sort of where you lose connection with yourself. And I guess that's the whole point, right? They want you to put your guards down and let this tsunami of words take over your mentality. So it's a kind of linguistic authoritarianism, right? There's no willingness to say, this is my philosophy, this is my axiom, these are my definitions, right? No, it follows, right? That's how it is, right? That's how they do it. And I don't buy it for one freaking second, right?
Physicality is what appears on the dashboard. If the airplane sensors don't make a measurement, then the dashboard shows nothing. Mm-hmm. Is it so complicated to understand?
Well, if you have been born in this, and this is a metaphor, this airline pilot, pilot cabin. What's it called? The chamber they're sitting in there, the pilot, whatever, cockpit, right? The cockpit, I think it's called. If when he uses that, he appeals to an access to an outside, because these dials on this dashboard are created because those who created it have an idea, because they have experienced something outside the cockpit, right? But your experience, and I should talk for myself, my experience is all I have, right? I can't just say this is a representation of this, that, and the outside without clarifying how I get to it, right? Just because I have been used to treating it as something that is a representation of an outside doesn't mean that it is a representation of an outside, right? It doesn't follow. It's stupid argumentation. It's habitual thinking, right? And when you say then that your experience is a representation, then you have to consider that an axiom. It is not argued, right? He is appealing by using these metaphors and grooming you to have this understanding, a same kind analogy of the cockpit, and then you transfer that over to your own experience and consider yourself, your experience as sitting in that cockpit and having a notion that there's an outside you actually have access to, or should be able to imagine at least, because of that fictitious metaphor that appeals to you having access to that outside, right? It's a sophist trick. It's a trick he does. He appeals to something you cannot possibly have access to by appealing to something you have access to that is a part of your experience, right?
And it's not magical. It's not quantum, oh my God, quantum Mysterianism. No, there are no physical entities unless you measure, for exactly the same reason that the dashboard died.
What does that mean? That which you use to measure with, is that not a physical entity? So that which you're using to measure with, whatever that is, I don't know exactly what he is referring to. Don't you have to have a standalone existence of that in order to measure? So you can't measure either, right? How does this ridiculous word salad function, right? It sounds like it's so, oh, whoa, it's so, and science, oh my God, they have proven there is no standalone physical, so therefore, mommy, Mommy and her religion must be right. Yes.
Trials show nothing unless they are plain sensors measure. What we have to abandon is this notion that the external world is the physical world. It isn't.
The physical world. What do you mean, the physical world? What is that? Is that an external world? Because what a physicalist does is, of course, erroneous to think that the photograph of the moon is actually the moon, because you have never really seen the moon. You have only had these photographs, which is his way of analogizing, using that cockpit analogy, right? So if you only ever had these photographs, you consider those reality, because that's how your work, that's how your everyday functions, treating them as an external reality. What an idealist realizes is it cannot possibly be an outside if you have established that inside-outside dichotomy. It must be an inside you're referring to, right? So even if you call it an outside, that which you're referring to, the experiences, must be inside. Otherwise, you wouldn't have access to them, right? That goes without kind of saying. But, it should be said, because most people don't realize this. And that's the paradox that is built into materialism, which is correctly identified by Bernardo, in my opinion, right? As far as I understand. But then he keeps the idea of this external world while he has just retracted from it by saying they're just experiences. Then just experiences doesn't mean in any way, shape or form that you still have an outside, right? How do you get to do that? That's even more crazy, that somebody believing their experiences is an outside. If you realize your experiences are just experiences, the outside all of a sudden disappears from your argumentation. Then my point is, how do you then get to still say there is an outside? Because that outside was just habitual thinking in the materialist version. You just retracted that and said you're just referring to an experience, right?
The external world is what's measured. The physical world is the representation of the measurement results on the dashboard. Physical experiments have shown already, unless you believe.
So if I'm not really interested in this kind of thinking that what you measure, it only exists when you measure it, and it's sort of, you can't check that, because if you need to measure in order to have existence, you can't rely on any existence unless you measure it. And don't you also have to have an existence of measurements instrument in order to do the measurement? Isn't it a self-refuting argument, this? I mean, I'm not buying this shit, right? This kind of fluffiness is, and in general, appeal to science to clarify metaphysics is also a dysfunctional structure, right? For a simple reason, which is you need to have done metaphysics in order to start to do science, right? Metaphysics is foundational to science. You don't have science unless you have done metaphysics. So you can't just turn around and say, hey, I'm bringing this science in to clarify my metaphysics, which is the same as saying that science has done perfect metaphysics on which they're basing their science, which I'm then going to bring in to my imperfect metaphysics in order to make it perfect. Ridiculous, right?
Believe in egregiously gratuitous and inflationary science fiction, like Evereshian multiverses or the magical, undetermined, hidden variables of superdeterminism. Unless you're prepared to entertain fantasy, experimental evidence has refuted the standalone existence of physical entities.
Mm-hmm.
And neuroscience of consciousness now has a number of examples that
I think I'm willing to say that he tries to throw out the baby with the bathwater by pointing to this paradox in materialism, which I agree with. There is a paradox in the thinking, and thereby using it to just get rid of, the complete set of thinking that is entailed in, or that is sort of scientific approach to describing what is beyond your experiences, right? So he can get rid of it by saying there's a problem there. It's like saying one of the wheels on your car doesn't work, therefore you can only use bicycles. It's like, that's too much, right? You want to throw everything out so to get rid of and come over to my perfect philosophy here, right? It's not very difficult, actually, right? You just have to convince materialists that what they're referring to cannot possibly be the outside if they say there is an outside, right? It must be then what in the case of an inside-outside dichotomy in the thinking is the inside. It can't be otherwise then, right? Otherwise you're violating the inside-outside dichotomy you just created as a materialist, right? So you just have to say, okay, what you are referring to when you're doing science is your experiences, no matter what, in any case. That doesn't matter, it's not functional what you're doing, right? And he's using science left and right, so I don't see, that big of a problem in this, right? It's like he wants to refute science when it comes to this paradox. So no, don't look at the materialists, they're crazy. But he wants to use materialist science when he needs it, right? That sort of doesn't work for me either, right? Sort of cherry-picking fashion.
Show a inverse correlation between brain activity and the richness and intensity of experience. The most famous one is, of course, psychedelics. You have the richest, most intense experience of your life.
Richest and most intense, this is the bullshit bingo, right? Just because they are weird and different in quality or vivacity, as Hume might say, right, doesn't mean they're richer. Rich is sort of positive word, right? He's trying to frame this experience as richer, which is an sophist way, in my opinion, in this context, to say it's better than the normal experience, right? Well, if somebody stabs me in the chest with a knife, I'm having a rich experience, right? There's all sorts of rich experiences. But are they rich? Rich is sort of positive, right? But they would be rich, there would be a lot of experience, right?
If while the activity of your brain has only reduced with respect to the baseline, but there is more. Pilots undergoing G-force training in centrifuges, they pass out. But when they come round, they report, and I will quote, memorable dreams. In other words, what we take to be unconsciousness is just unresponsiveness. Those people are not unconscious at all. They are experiencing memorable dreams. Or another example, acquired savant syndrome. People who suffer accidents or a shot in the head or suffer head trauma, they suddenly become capable of incredible mathematical feats, or they start composing music like professional composers, even though they have no training, or they become exquisite.
So there it is. If you get shot through the head, you might become a famous composer, right? You start to, rub shoulders with Beethoven or something like that, right? Or, whatever. Yes, I understand that, from a clinical point of view, it's just like the doctor who's not aware that what he says to the patient will sort of hurt them or give them. It's kind of this lack of empathy with human beings, right? You don't understand the consequences of or potential consequences of what you're sitting there saying. I find that worrying, to say the least, right? And I want to disclaim anything he says. I'm just telling you, don't do this at home, right? Don't think of this as an encouragement, which it might come across as the way he puts it, right?
Artists. So that's another instance of impaired brain function leading to.
So now we have had, people who have taken drugs, people who have, in these velodromes of losing consciousness in G-force, and somebody shot through the head, right?
Broader.
And he keeps going.
Consciousness. Or Vietnam War veterans, that's a study from 2016. War veterans, more than 100 of them were studied. Damage to specific parts of the brain is correlated with a much higher propensity to so-called spiritual or religious insight.
Okay, so now there are hundreds of people, men who have been shot in the head or something like that, right? And that we can use for these experiments. Yes. Just like they did down in the Theresienstadt. They used various, of these inmates for, in the Nuremberg Code later, right? It's like that, these people who are, for some reason, have been shot in the head, and we can use them for, right? It just, oh, man, right? There's no empathy or sympathy for these people who have been shot in the head. Why are people being shot in the head in what you call a war? Why? Is that not much more important than you can maybe figure out they have some transcendental whatever, right?
A more prospective study was done in Italy in 2010, in which people who were to undergo operations for the removal of brain tumors, they were studied for an index called self-transcendence, your ability to identify to something bigger than yourself.
Able to identify with something bigger than yourself. What would that be? What is bigger than myself? What is a myself? And what does it mean that it's bigger, right? This is sort of, okay, now we're sort of sliding into this woo-woo landscape, right? And that I have a strong sense that's where he wants to be. Because it comforts him to be able to talk about another world than the actual living, material, whatever term you want to put on it, everyday world he possibly finds annoying and and painful and whatever, suicidal, whatever, right? And all these capitalists out there, right? Donald Trump and Poot, right? Putin. Ooh. Let me retract into my mental, the biggerness of than my mind, myself. It's bigger than me. I feel cushioned by the big mind. Oh.
They were scored for that before and after surgery. And after surgery, which always causes damage in surrounding cerebral tissue.
Okay, so there's damage in the cerebral tissue. I guess that's the part of the brain, right? So is a damage going to be the ticket to good metaphysics? Somebody reporting about somebody screwing around in somebody's brain and saying, hey, I'm asking you a question, what do you think? And I'm going to put that together and into an analysis and creating some statistics and whatever, and lo and behold, an idea of metaphysics arrives. I mean, I'm not buying it for one, right? I mean, you have to argue from your own experience. You can't argue from somebody else's experience, right? Because that is not an experience of yours. I don't know how else to put it, man, right? It's like somebody saying, I'm watching this movie here, right? And then I see what I call George Clooney, right? And then I think I'm going to meet George Clooney out in the foyer in the movie theater because I saw George Clooney there, right? It's something like this. You have an experience. You interpret in a certain way, and you expect there to be some kind of existence, right? Or that George Clooney on the screen says, I have a dog. Therefore, dogs exist outside the movie theater, right? Something like that. it doesn't follow from the experience, right? It's a way of making sure, or my approach is making sure that your arguments are not just grabbed out of your ass, right? You have to either argue rigidly from where you started in your argumentation, in your metaphysics, or the only alternative, in my opinion, is stating an action that says, I am working from this, right? I am working from this. Then you're not trying to inflict your thinking on me as if you should be able to go there by yourself because there's no other choice. That's how it is. It's mind out there, right?
Spiritual self-transcendence, the index of self-transcendence is much higher. So people have a broader, deeper experience of life, despite impairment of brain function. Or even trivial things, Tevin, like choking.
Yes.
Teenagers worldwide have figured out, and this is a very dangerous thing, that partial strangulation.
At least he says it's a dangerous thing. But he still talks about it.
Can give you a psychedelic.
He keeps going. It's like, it's dangerous, but let me give it an air of, it could be interesting, right?
Trip. You can go to other dimensions, speak to alien beings.
You can go to other dimensions and alien beings.
It's an unfathomable experience.
It's an unfathomable. It's dangerous, but it's unfathomable, right?
By partial strangulation. Of course, some of them died.
Partial strangulation, and then he does like this. You have to strangle yourself. I mean, you have to have an interesting. Just talk to Michael Hutchins from In Excess, right? Well, you can't talk to him. You can talk to him, but he's not going to answer, right? Shows you a kind of what we're dealing with here, right? He's appealing to something that you might die from, right?
Because turned out they actually get strangulated. But strangulation, which reduces blood flow to the brain and therefore reduces metabolism, a generalized reduction of brain metabolism, leads to much richer and intenser experience.
Richer and more intensive, right? It's positive. It's framed in a positive light, right? It's dangerous. Oh, but it's so you can go to other dimension and meet aliens and oh man, right? And somebody who's sort of tired of living might say, well, I'm going to strangle myself. I want these kinds of experiences. Now I'm saying, don't fucking do this at home, right? This lack of empathy is telling to me, right? Because then he is, in all of his philosophy then, there is nowhere that any kind of empathy is going to stop him from getting to whatever conclusions he wants to go to, right? He won't have a skeptical self-criticism that is anyway based on empathy, right? Where he sort of, if he leads to the conclusion that all women should be, violated, okay, that's where my philosophy goes then, right? It's sort of, you might want to double check somewhere, right? But this lack of empathy is that, all right, I'm just going to talk about these 100 soldiers who were shot in the head. It's an interesting phenomenon. These people who almost died, or, right? Yes. Not interested in why the hell are these people being shot through the head, right? That's not of concern. No, I'm an academic, right? I'm a doctor in philosophy,
I could go on and on and on, but this shows that...
oh, please don't, right? Get to the fucking point.
Experience is not caused by brain activity, because there are cases in which brain activity reduces and experience increases, and both happen in significant amounts, significant degrees. So what this shows us is that brain activity is what inner experience looks like. And unlike...
Inner experience looks like? Well, yes, but that's a tautology. And my inner experience is what it looks like. That's what inner experience is, right? It's just another word, it's a tautology. You're not saying anything then, right? And you haven't explained how you get to that external world from just retracting the materialist's paradox of that external world, right? Where they think that those experience is the actual external world that they have come up with for some reason that is not argued for philosophically, right? And you retracting from that and saying, no, you just have your experiences, your so-called screen of perception, as he calls it, right? Then what is it then if you have just refuted the external world, right? Or if you haven't refuted the external world, you're just saying that which you experience isn't your external world. Then what makes you keep that external world? What makes you able to keep that in your thinking? Because there's nothing apparently about your experiences that leads you to that outside world. Then what other than your habitual thinking and things like that gives you an external world? If you have to do it philosophically, as I suppose you're doing here, then you have to point to that which you have in order to establish it. Otherwise, you're a mystic, right? You have to point to the perception, the screen of perception, say, that is why I can say there is an outside world. If you can't do that, you don't have that outside world, right? I don't care how much you have to call yourself a solipsist, then you have to argue for it, or you have to state it as an axiom, right? You can't make it axiomatically and then pretend it to be an argument, as if people should be able to go there, right? And you're just pretending it's not an axiom. So you don't have to state the axiom, an axiom being something that is particular to your philosophy, right? Then it would be your axiom and your thinking. And you would have to state that this is my thinking, right? And then appealing to everybody else having their own kind of thinking, or at least settling whether or not they're willing to go along with your axiom. But he doesn't want that. He wants to be an authority, right? He wants to appeal to this. It follows. And if you don't go along with me, there's something wrong with you. And I'm going to block you on Twitter, just like he's doing with me, because I'm critical about his shitty philosophy, right? Okay, let's jump into... let's see if I can find... In the comment section... Should be here somewhere. Oh man, where is it? Where the hell is the comment section? Should be able to find it somewhere. That is all the way down here. Okay. So I wrote a comment here, and this is minute 216:56. Where Bernardo says, an objective idealist, it's a quote, the quote is, an objective idealist would say, no, there really is an external world out there. It's just, that's all he says. There really is, right? It really is, right? I mean, that's not a fucking argument, right? An objective idealist, and I might also ask, what's an objective idealist compared to an idealist or an analytic idealist? But never mind. Would say no to a solipsist implicitly, right? There really is an external world out there. But that's not a fucking argument, man, right? And I say, why? What is the argument? It is not good enough to just say there is. You have to argue how you get to it, right? Otherwise, any claim could just be made without any justification of any kind. You can just say, it is. There it is. Done. Right? Bernardo Kastrup has yet to present any kind of argument other than, it must be there. Oh, you cannot argue against it. If he cannot present a coherent argument, he needs to state it as an axiom that he is working from, exactly because he cannot argue for it, right? That people uncritically just let this pass is a sign of either ignorance of good argumentation, or a willful ignorance for a need for some kind of way to argue for an external safe space of their own, right? They want to go there because they need it, because it feels good, right? And it aligns with mommy's craziness. And no, don't throw the idea that because I write this text, I must be out there beyond the text, right? And this is not well formulated, but I think you get the gist of what I'm trying to say there. That is stupid. But just because you are not solipsist doesn't mean that you all of a sudden have proven that there is an outside, right? Just because you say, that's not a car, therefore bicycles exist. It's something along the same lines, right? It's not the same, but it's sort of the same kind of bad argumentation structure. They all of a sudden have proven that there is an outside. A rejection of solipsism in itself is not an argument. If you reject solipsism, it's the rejection. It's not an argument. It's like saying, I don't like solipsism. I can't work from the idea of solipsism. So therefore, it's bad philosophy. It's not a good argument, is it? Right? It seems like whenever people get to solipsism, it's like, oh my God, no, I can't do that. No, because Bernardo would be mad at me, yes, and I would be alone. No, right? But maybe the foundational Cartesian doubt ends up with something that is solipsism, but you're not supposed necessarily to stay there. It doesn't mean you say, okay, solipsism, and you have to stay there. No, that's when you start to really philosophizing and doing metaphysics, right? And if you have to go somewhere saying, I can't live without this philosophy over here, then say, okay, create the axiom, say that you are going there. Don't make this pretense of argued philosophy that everybody should be able to go there just like that. And everything in this lack of argumentation that Bernardo Kastrup seems to be putting across here is exactly why I point out you need to do it as an axiom. Because you can't argue for it, right, in my opinion. But if anything, let me take that. A rejection of solipsism in itself is not an argument, but if anything, an inability to function accordingly, which I mean, I can't function without going away from solipsism, right? And that's why solipsism, that's a bad argument to say, well, I can't work from solipsism. So therefore solipsism is bad philosophy. That doesn't follow, right? That's also bad argumentation. But if Bernardo Kastrup has a watertight argument, let me have it. I of course expect it to be based on an aspect of his screener perception, colors, sounds, taste, touch, and smells, which necessitates that there must be something beyond his perception, right? I think it was actually pretty well formulated, this one. I tried to keep it short, right? Okay, and let's have it from 2:1656.
An idealist, an objective idealist, would say, no, there is really an external world out there that is not in my mind. But that external world is also mental. It's not.
But that's the problem, right? There's something out there that isn't in my mind. Then how the hell can you talk about it like that? I mean, you are basically appealing to an axiom without saying, I am axiomizing this, right? He's saying it as if it's an axiom. He just doesn't call it that, right? He's not sufficiently rigid in his way of presenting his shit. He makes it sound like, well, it follows. It's sort of, you're weird if you're not going along with this, right? He's not sufficiently humble and individual or individualist in his approach, because philosophy has to be this authority. That's my interpretation, right? So he presents us as if it sort of follows by some magic that he doesn't have to clarify, right? The only way you can get to that external world, in my opinion, is by stating it clearly as an axiom that you are working from. You can inflict axioms on other people, right? When you are appealing to an implicit argumentation of some kind, in this case without stating it, you are implicitly appealing to everybody should follow along for this, right? And sort of grooming them into, well, I better go along with it because otherwise, the emperor's new clothes, right? They will call me stupid. So I have to get along with this, right? And that's why he gets it without stating the actual argument. He gets you to be convinced about the correctness of this elusive argument, right?
not in my mind, but it's mental. Just like your thoughts are mental, but they are not in my mind. They are external to me.
His thoughts is not in his mind. How do you know they're thoughts? If they're not in your mind, you don't have access to them. You're violating the problem of other minds now, right? So it's like sometimes it feels like he's all over the place without realizing how ridiculous some of the things he does. It's like he's just so convinced about it, he doesn't even have to argue about it. That's a problem. If a philosopher is convinced of his conclusions so much that he presents them as if they're just given to you, right? That's a big problem, right? And I will encourage you to think for yourself and be highly skeptical of anybody doing metaphysics without clarifying clearly how they get from A to B, right? Because getting from A to B in your argumentation is exactly what philosophy is. And if you're not doing how you get from A to B well, you're not doing good philosophy. You're actually doing the opposite of philosophy, in my opinion, which would be something like cherry-picking your conclusions, or mysticism, or just connecting the dots in a confirmation bias fashion, right? So, that's all I have for you today. Another example of the weirdness of Bernardo Kastrup. And there's also something I have wondered lately, and I've been following him for 3 or 4 years now, right? And that is, it's the same examples, it's the same structure of argumentation. He says the same thing every time, right? It's the same examples, it's the same way of arguing. It's like he's programmed, right? He doesn't try a new angle, right? If you go back in time and listen to these kinds of presentation of analytic idealism for God knows how many years, you would see the same line of argumentation every time. Why? It's like a programmed robot or something, like. It's just sort of try to use something new. Try to show your flexibility, the dynamics of your philosophy. And if you're sitting here going on God knows how many years now, right? Trying to use the same argumentation in order to convince people of this, and they might not really be that convinced, or at least only those who want it to be the case is following you. All the crazies are following you because they want this crazy philosophy to blue stamp their weird mysticism, right? You're the Pied Piper of crazy people, right? I don't like that. Please share, like, subscribe, consider a donation, links below, and otherwise, see you in the next one. Have a nice day.